And so in this issue of rethinking, our next speaker, Professor Stephen Castles, who has already contributed in question time very meaningfully, but is now going to contribute a keynote address. And he's looking at this whole issue of all those contexts that need to be taken into account as we rethink our migration policy. Our migration policy designed to address things in the past, how does it look at the issue of the current? And he'll take us that from an international perspective, as you'll see from his CV. He clearly comes from a very rich international perspective there, but I was particularly struck by, in the early 1990s, when he'd been working on Asian migration, he was one of the founders of the UNESCO Asia-Pacific Migration Research Network, which helped start political, social and cultural research on Asia. And then the next bit, at a time when most Asian governments and academics were only interested in economic aspects. Now, we've had put before us this morning this whole issue of if you box away migration in one box, economics, what does that then mean? And Helen, you were taking the same point. Do we take it from a demographic context, an economic prospect, social prospect, an ethics, values prospect? Well, we're going to be helped enormously in terms of how we think about Australia's policy by understanding what's happening in the international research context. So Stephen Castles is going to do that for us. So please would you welcome Professor Stephen Castles on Rethinking Australian Migration.
Well, it's a great honour to be here, and especially to be at the first conference after the sad passing of Graham Hugo, who was a great leader in our field, and I think we'll all miss him very much, or already do. Helen Feist, Paul James and Lynn Arnold have already covered a lot of the ground I wanted to cover, so I'll try and be brief when these things have already been said. I do, however, just want to make one contribution to the debate that Paul started. I'm wondering, really, whether an ethic of care and, the notion of compassion are what should drive immigration policy. Australia has always acted in its self-interest, and that has often been beneficial to refugees and migrants. And I think the problem today is not self-interest, it's just the very narrowing of the definition of self-interest to almost just the economic. And I think we won't get much further if we represent our self-interest by saying, nope, nope, nope. Or if we say, I'm waiting for a government briefing. You're all familiar with the politicians who do that. I think we really have to rethink what is in our interests, not just as an economy, but above all as a society. And I think it's in our interests to show solidarity. It's in our interests to be a good global citizen. It's in our interests to work within the region for regional solutions. And there need be no contradiction between that self-interest and an ethical point of view. But I think, self-interest is something that is much more tangible for a lot of people, especially people who themselves are having a hard time. So, we need new leadership in the debate, the sort of leadership that, for all his sins, Malcolm Fraser offered back in the 70s in this area. And we just don't have it at the moment from any party, I have to say. Anyway, that just to start with. Yeah. Can we have the next? Oh, I have to do it, don't I? I haven't quite caught up with the technology yet. So what I want to argue is that there have been major changes in Australia's immigration context, and we really need to catch up with them to rethink our approaches. There have been big changes at the global and regional level. We have moved from population building migration to economic migration. We need to think, is that the right way to see things? As Helen said, there's been a major growth in temporary and circular migration, which makes a big difference not only to immigration as such, but also to the whole issue of settlement, national identity, and commitment to citizenship. The Australian model of multiculturalism, which I think has been a very successful one, is now in need of rethinking too, because, well, especially because of the phenomenon of temporary migration. And I think what has happened over the last few years is that these major changes that have been taking place have been masked by this one-sided emphasis on stopping the boats. Of course, asylum and refugees are an important part of migration, an important part of the population flows we have to relate to, but they shouldn't obscure the fact that we've had major shifts without any real public debate. This is just to give you an overview of what's happening globally. The world migrant population has grown. These figures only go up to 2,000. It's quite a bit more now. And it looks as if there's a steady upward trend. But if you then relate it to population, this is the same data related to global population size. There is no real increase in international migration in the sense of people living outside their country of birth over quite a long period. I think if you took it up to 2015, you would see some increase. But it's not nearly as dramatic as people think. About 3% of the world's population live outside their country of birth. That means 97% of the world's population are not international migrants. These are the latest United Nations figures of world migrant stock, the number of people living outside their country of birth. And you can see it has increased. It's about 232 million in 2013, according to the UN. 3.1% of the global population. Of course, if we were to include internal migration, which we should, because internal migration is often just as big a shift as international migration, it would be much higher. But it's very, very hard to calculate or get data on internal migration, but for all sorts of reasons, which I won't go into. The UN Development Programme estimated some 750 million internal migrations, 3 times as much as international migration. But that's really more guesswork than anything. What's really significant is concentration. The fact that migrants don't move just anywhere, they move where they can make a livelihood. And as you can see, that means a lot of movement into developed regions. That's where the biggest growth has been. And it means, above all, concentration in cities. So if you look at cities like Toronto, London, and of course, Sydney and Melbourne, you find very high proportions of the population are either immigrants or children of immigrants. In Sydney, it's probably about half the population. So where are these immigrants? Well, the United States takes something like 1 million immigrants a year and is by far the largest single destination. And you can see that Australia and Canada are down there below, but of course, being small countries in population, it doesn't figure so much. It's much more interesting to look at the figures again in relation to population. And then, of course, Australia has the largest immigrant intake per capita of any country in the world, closely followed by Japan. Interesting to look at Germany and France, which are close behind, and some new immigrations like Spain, Malaysia and so on. Spain, of course, it would be much less if those are figures from 2010. It's much less now because of the economic crisis. So what about our region? And I think migration is coming more and more from our region, from India, from China, but also from South Korea, from Indonesia. the flows of population in Asia are enormously complex at the present time. And that map, you can't really interpret it. It's just so complicated. There are flows in all directions. And again, it's also already out of date. It's a 2010 map, or 2011, I think. And for instance, the flow between Australia and New Zealand is now much more a two-way flow than that map indicates. So very hard to keep up with it. So to put it in an interpretation rather than trying to use massive amounts of data, we can look at the forms of migration that are now important in our region. And we can see that there is still skilled migration, people who are already trained and well-educated, going to North America, Oceania, and Europe. And often that is permanent migration leading to family reunion. And of course, the flows of the highly skilled are a form of, you could say, as our Indian colleagues sometimes say, a form of development aid from poor countries to rich countries, because those people carry with them all the human capital that they have gained in their education process. We have that in Australia too, when our students come to us from, say, India, where they already have a first degree from an Indian Institute of Technology, which is usually at a very high standard, and then they do a master's or a doctorate in Australia. While they are studying, they're a source of labour because they're allowed to work 20 hours a week, and they have to because the fees are so high that they couldn't survive otherwise. So they're a source of labour for the low end of the economy while they're studying, and then after they're finished studying, a very large number have to stay whether they want to or not because they've got massive debts to pay off. Their family has gone into debt to allow them to study in Australia. So again, one of my Indian colleagues, Binod Kadria, calls that reverse remittances, a transfer of wealth, again, from poor countries to rich countries. However, skilled migration is extending to other parts of our region as economies take off. So skilled migrants now also go to Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, China, and other countries. And there is an increasing global and regional competition for skills. And I'll come back to that because we have to think, why should skilled people come to Australia? As of course we hope they will. There is also massive temporary labour migration. I'll give you some figures in a moment. From Southeast and East Asia to the Gulf oil countries. And that is temporary migration because people are not allowed to stay. The family reunion is not permitted. And it's interesting in the light of the discussion we were having earlier about migration and development. Sometimes it's migration instead of development. And it's worth remembering that the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines, quite a long time ago, actually started labour export as a way of getting rid of discontent and preventing land reform. And that factor of using labour migration to avoid structural change has continued in the Philippines. So there is no automatic link between migration and development. I'm very interested in the fairly new phenomenon of marriage migration, which is very big in some countries. Something like 10 to 15% of all marriages in South Korea are between a Korean man and a foreign bride. And it's a form of labour migration. South Korea only brings in, or predominantly brings in, male migrant workers, usually people who are willing to do low-skilled jobs. It's very hard for women to migrate to South Korea as workers. So marriage migration becomes a surrogate for labour migration and is often done in a highly exploitative way. I can go into more detail if anyone's interested. Educational migration, of course, is a large and growing phenomenon. But again, we must ask ourselves the question, why should students come to Australia? Are we really so much better than other places? And at the moment, we're finding that other universities in China, in Thailand, in Korea, and so on, are as good, if not better, in some respects than Australian ones. And I think if we're not very careful, if we don't look after our foreign students well, we're going to lose that edge. And of course, the refugee flows that Paul was talking about a lot have continued in the region. There've been refugee flows for many years in our region, but they've reached new peaks in recent times. Just a few figures. There are 6 million people from ASEAN countries working in other ASEAN states, and that's usually there are certain countries which are developing or where their economy is not developing very fast, like Indonesia, Bangladesh, and so on. And those, Bangladesh isn't ASEAN, of course, but where they are moving to the fast-growing countries in the region, like Malaysia and Singapore. The main destination, though, for Asian temporary workers remains the Middle East. 2.8 million workers in 2009, just to give an example. There is massive migration in Central Asia, particularly migration into Russia, which is often connected with the resources industry, with oil production and so on. And we don't have data, at least I haven't been able to find any useful data on that. And then, of course, we have Australia and New Zealand as mainly immigration countries, but also emigration countries too. This chart shows the regions to which Asian migrants go. It's a little bit out of date. It's based on 2000 censuses. But you'll see that Australia comes fifth, or Oceania comes fifth, in terms of choice of where to go. So we can't automatically assume that we will get in Australia the immigrants that we see as useful for our economy. Why should Asians migrate to Australia? We really have to ask that question. And this is where one gets to the sort of assumptions that our policy has been based on and which are now, I think, subject to question in many ways. So we used to assume that our borders were easily controllable because, of course, Australia is girt by sea. That is far less the case. People are far more mobile. And we have, of course, the phenomenon of boat arrivals, but much more significant is the number of people arriving by plane, and there's not nearly such a polemic about that, and then either overstaying or taking on work that they're not, that they don't have visas for and so on. It's much, much harder to control borders than in the past. And one could argue in some ways that's a good thing, but we're getting more like the European situation. The old principle, as Mr. Howard said some years ago, is that the Australian government decides who comes to Australia. Well, that's no longer as clear as it used to be. Now it's much more a question of markets, families, companies deciding who they want to come. We've assumed that people will always want to come and bring their skills and labour to Australia. Is that going to be the case in the future? We've assumed that most people would settle. Today, migration is much more complex. We have many different types of migrants, and some of them will not settle, but will still spend years here and be part of our population in that period. We used to think we were a receiving country, that people would move to Australia and stay here. Now we're dealing with multi-directional migration, including, of course, Australian emigration. People have different motivations. The multicultural model is a settlement model. It's a very successful one, but it's based on the idea that most people who come here will want to settle. Do we need to rethink multiculturalism if large numbers of people don't want to settle anymore? And that brings us to a theme that Helen already introduced of transnational identities. What do transnational identities mean for our future policies? I won't go into this in detail because Helen's already covered it. Just the chart is interesting because it does show that while family migration and humanitarian migration has remained pretty much the same, we have this massive increase in skilled migration. This is talking about permanent migrants. So at the moment we have about 130,000 skilled migrants a year who make up by far the largest component of the overall migration program. This is something, Helen has already covered too, the fact that a very large proportion of our population are overseas born, over a fifth. If you add, the last line of this, the Australians born with one or both parents born overseas, it's nearly a fifth. So you add that together, about 2/5 of our population have a very close relationship with the migration process. We are truly a country of migrants in the way that very few others are. And this is the new phenomenon, the temporary migrants to Australia, and I think Helen had better data on this than I did. But interesting is the overall growth in temporary migration, and in the latest figures from the department, we see that working holiday makers are a very important category. I've got to talk to Helen later because I used to find that the Department of Immigration had a very good website that gave easy access to data. It's much harder to find anything these days on that website, and she's obviously better at it than I. So let's look. These are what I just showed you were flow figures. In other words, the number who came in each year. This is the stock figure, the number of temporary migrants who were here on a certain day, in this case the last day of 2014. And you can see what the different categories are. So we have about just over 1.2 million temporary residents in this country, which is something like 6% of the total Australian population. Now that is a very significant change that has hardly been explored. The New Zealanders I've left separate because it's very hard to say whether New Zealanders are temporary or permanent migrants because they have the right to stay. And then we have the fact that Australia has become an emigration country, and there we owe this very much to the work of Graham Hugo, who wrote about this before almost anyone else. These are his figures, in fact, and therefore a little bit out of date. But there is an Australian diaspora, of course, partly in Britain and other European countries, but also increasingly in East and Southeast Asia. So we are no longer just an immigration country, we're also an emigration country. And I think emigration is sure to increase because it becomes more and more important for young Australians to gain experience in international labour markets. So why should skilled migrants or other migrants want to come to Australia? Is it because they can earn more here? Oh, here we go. I suggest if we just focus on the economic side, we may be perpetuating illusions and we may be losing out in the long run. because I think a lot of the developing Asian countries are paying better salaries and will go on paying better salaries than Australian companies can, or that Australian companies are willing to pay. I don't think we can just base our idea of immigration on economic criteria, as we have to a large extent in the past. And I think we need to emphasize other factors, because Australia actually has a lot going for it, which is not economic. Strong rights for permanent residents, the fact that this is a good place to bring up children, the fact that there is access to an attractive lifestyle here. And I mean, despite all the threats to our environment, the environmental situation is still a lot better than in some of the competing countries. Political rights and security are important too, and the fact that multiculturalism does offer a model of inclusion that has been very successful. So what would that mean specifically for South Australia? How should South Australia, in a way, is more interested in receiving migrants than several other states, simply because of the loss of population, of young people moving away? What does South Australia have to offer? I think South Australia, I mean, I had a look at the 30-year plan of the Department of Planning and Local Government. I know John Kellett is going to go into a lot more detail in this, but it seems to me that South Australia really could do very well by not talking about economic benefits, but talking about lifestyle, affordable housing, reasonably good transport, and lower levels of stress than living in Sydney and Melbourne. So I think South Australia could do quite well in this if it really thinks what is good about life in this area. What could we really offer people? I still think one of the main benefits of moving to Australia is the multicultural model. And that the multicultural model came in, as someone already remarked, with the Whitlam government in the early 70s, and it's gone through as many changes, or probably more changes, than there have been governments since. It's constantly being redefined. It's had some constant features, like the idea of family migration and permanent settlement, access to citizenship, the right to learn English, implemented by the Adult Migrant Education Service, or also by the schools. For me, the high point of multiculturalism was in the late 80s and the beginning of the early 90s with the Hawke and Keating governments, where multiculturalism was defined as an attribute of citizenship. The idea that one had a right to one's own culture and religion and language, and a right to equal participation in all areas of society, but at the same time, the state had a duty to fight racism and discrimination, but migrants had obligations which were laid down in the national agenda for multicultural Australia in 1989. And then a little bit later, that was turned into the notion of productive diversity, that it was actually economically beneficial to have a diverse population, which I think in a way was a step backwards, because we should be talking about the benefits for society and not just the economy. We've certainly had a move backwards since the mid-90s. Firstly, the Pacific Solution, which was, embodied the idea that migrants or refugees were threatening and should be kept away from the public and put in camps and sent offshore. We've had a sort of securitization of migration policy, a great concern with possible threats in recent years. And the most tangible form of reducing multiculturalism was the Australian Citizenship Act of 2007, which raised the period to qualify for being an Australian citizen from 2 to 4 years and introduced a citizenship test with questions that were, let's say, in some respects, highly questionable, like what was Don Bradman's batting average, which all of us know, of course. And you can't be a citizen unless you know that. It has been changed since, I have to add. That went a little bit too far. But the discourse now is really on people from outside as a threat, and of course particularly Muslims as a threat to Australian society. So it's all about stopping the boats of these people seeking protection, who are escaping war, escaping persecution, being a threat to Australia, the idea that we should all be part of Team Australia, and that means having particular attitudes and behaviour. You've seen the attempts to water down the Racial Discrimination Act, which fortunately haven't succeeded so far. And the whole discourse now is on social cohesion and harmony rather than on rights and citizenship, and I find that very disturbing. And the most recent issue, of course, is the idea of taking away people's citizenship if they don't behave in the way the government thinks is appropriate. And again, that is highly controversial and is being discussed right now. However, I think we need to go beyond the multiculturalism. Probably a good starting point would be multiculturalism as we had it in the early 1990s. But we need to go beyond that, because what do temporary migrants really want? Have we asked them? Have we really done research to find out what the perspectives of temporary migrants are? Very little, I think. Obviously, people who come here temporarily, I mean, that could mean 3, 4, 5 years. Even people who have permanent immigration status often leave after a certain period. They return to their homelands or they move on to other countries. People are becoming much more mobile. They're also much more in touch with their communities of origin through the new social media, through mobile phones, through Skype and so on. What do people really want? Do they want to assimilate to some sort of Australian culture? Do they want to adapt temporarily rather than think about long-term plans of settlement? We don't really know, but we need to find out. And we need to think through, what are the consequences? How could we reframe our immigration policies to recognise the fact that temporary migrants may stay and may not, that permanent migrants also may stay and may not, and may have quite different needs. And I would suggest we need to do some of the following. We need to recognise that people who are mobile and who have choices to remain mobile will have multiple belongings. They will feel they're part of more than one society at once. They'll relate to more than one culture, more than one political system. People will have flexible identities, and a flexible identity means you can change code, you can function in another society, or you can go back to your original society and change the way you behave. You sometimes see that even in one country, that people will behave differently in a workplace situation from the family because there is a different cultural expectation. But we should also recognise that having this transnational mobile population brings us lots of benefits in terms of interchange, in terms of cultural learning, and even in the economic field. And we need to recognise that by changing our model of citizenship. If someone works and lives in Australia for a certain period, they accumulate rights. those rights should be portable. It should be possible, for instance, to accumulate welfare entitlements and then move on to another country and still have them. Political rights should be given even to people who are here temporarily, but we might have to have some sort of approach to active and dormant rights. In other words, that one can only take advantage of certain political rights as long as one is a resident of a country, and they then become dormant when one leaves. And we need to have portable rights on pensions, on education, on all sorts of entitlements. So we need to have a debate on what transnational belonging would really mean for our model of settlement and citizenship. And it's not just Australia, obviously, that needs to do it. I mean, this is a global tendency that is affecting many countries. So let me just come to some conclusions. I think the Australian model has been very successful. I think, as I said at the beginning, a lot of it has been based on self-interest. And the fact is that we've been able to increase our population, we've been able to change our society without major tensions and conflicts in a way that has perhaps not been possible in other parts of the world. But we really need to rethink, why should people come to Australia? What rights should they have when they come here? And how should we reshape our attitudes towards mobile populations? So the real issue is not what type of economy we want and what the economic contribution of migrants is, but what sort of society we want, and what is the potential contribution of migration to that society. Thank you very much.